February 2022. While the world was unaware of what was to come, the Russian army was advancing toward the Ukrainian border with the intention of invading. The Kremlin believed it could occupy Ukraine in less than 72 hours, but events did not unfold as expected. Shortly thereafter, the lush forests and fertile lands would be transformed into a blood-soaked swamp. A radio inside the forest, emitting strange sounds, would change the course of events in a paranormal way. Are you ready to see the dark side of the Ukraine-Russia war? Do you know the real reasons behind this war? That night never ended. A forest in the northeastern Black Sea region, unnamed on the map. The war had begun suddenly, and winter seemed as though it would never end. Winter had arrived months ago and seemed determined never to leave. The air was not bitterly cold, nor was it frozen, but it was strangely still. The wind did not blow. It seemed to be listening. The sky was gray and did not resemble either night or day. Fog hung between the trees. The trench, dug into the frozen mud, was filled with an unfamiliar heaviness. And in the middle of this heaviness, a 5-man reconnaissance unit of the Ukrainian army had stepped into the forest in search of a radio signal with an unknown coordinate. Commander Captain Petrenko was silent as usual, but this time, the silence was not just a matter of discipline. This time, it smelled of suspicion. Petrenko and the 4 soldiers behind him, Roman, Maxim, Andriy, and Stepan, followed him silently, trying to understand. The radio the soldiers had set out to find had been broadcasting the same sentence on the same frequency for 3 days. We are still fighting. The night never ends for us. No one had been able to locate the radio's coordinates, and a small team of soldiers had been assigned to find it. The radio did not appear on any maps and could not be located. Its coordinates could not be tracked via satellite, but the order had come from the Ukrainian government. The source of the signal must be found. The 5-man unit headed into the dense forest without hesitation. On the first day after reaching the forest, the usual tension of war was palpable among everyone. The crunching sound of frozen leaves breaking, hands on alert, and heavy breathing. No one from the Russian army was in sight, but night was slowly falling. And when it did, the language of the forest changed. The darkness between the trees was not just due to the absence of light. It was the weariness of war in this land. It was as if the entire landscape was rejecting the light. The soldiers lit a fire in the forest, but the flames only illuminated a small circle. Flashlights were useless in illuminating the surroundings. While on guard duty, Roman heard something interesting. Someone was saying his name. A muffled, anxious, and torn voice came from the trees about 10 meters ahead. Roman. It called out only once and did not repeat itself. But hearing it once was enough to unsettle Roman. He thought it was a hallucination, but it wasn't. The voice didn't sound human. When morning came, he didn't dare tell anyone, because when he closed his eyes, he could still hear the voice in his head. Morning had come, and on the second day, the GPS device suddenly stopped working. The compass began to spin like a clock. Instead of music, the radio was filled with breathing sounds. While he was trying to make sense of all this, the sky slowly began to darken. Petrenko said, "We'll stay one more night. We won't stay long." Maxim was a young and inexperienced new soldier. He was determined to decipher this signal. At noon, he sat down and decided to take apart the radio. He separated all the parts one by one. I found a piece that wasn't new, but looked like it had been recently installed. It had only this written on it: "The lost speak." Petrenko's expression didn't change. He just bowed his head and remained silent. That night when they set up camp, the weather suddenly changed. The thermometer still read -10, but not even their breath was visible. The rustling of the forest turned into a piercing screech. The campfire suddenly flared up, then died out even though there was no wind. A voice came from the radio again, but this time the sentence was different. "Come down. The light is no longer in the darkness." Roman's heartbeat quickened. He was scared. Andrei's hands were ice cold and trembling. Stepan began to pray aloud. Petrenko stood up and raised his head. The sky had disappeared. It had been replaced by a dense, pitch-black void. There was no moon. There were no stars. Only above in the darkness, a pair of eyes seemed to be shining. The soldiers began to grow even more uneasy. Roman thought to himself, "We made a mistake," and continued, "We shouldn't have come here." But they were already here, and it was too late for anything. There seemed to be no way back now. When morning came, one person was missing. It was Maxim. Everyone was frantically searching the forest for Maxim, who had suddenly vanished. He had left no trace behind. No signs of a struggle with an animal or a person. No footprints. After waking up in his tent, he hadn't even taken his gun with him. He had simply vanished into thin air. Petrenko checked everyone's guns. Then he picked up the radio to listen. For a while, he listened for any message that might come through the radio, and for the first time, his facial expression changed. His pupils dilated as if they were about to pop out of their sockets. He turned up the volume on the headphones. They all heard the same thing. "Maxim is here. He's waiting for you. We're not alone." Everyone was shocked by the message. Had the Russian soldiers kidnapped Maxim? No one could even guess where he had gone. All the soldiers were searching around nervously. Roman collapsed to his knees. Cramps gripped his stomach. Just then, the same voice repeated itself. But this time, the voice was slower. "The night never ends." This wasn't a radio message anymore. It was morning. What did it mean? It was a memory, an echo, a call. Could it be the voice of Russian soldiers? Had he been captured? Petrenko touched his shoulder. "We have to keep going," he said. "We're heading toward the source of the signal." As they moved deeper into the heart of the forest, the trees began to change. Some seemed to have grown on top of each other, others intertwined. On their bark, there were hands, thin, twig-like hands, but they had emerged from the ground and wrapped themselves around the trunks. Andrei crouched down. The only thing he said was, "They came here before us." But they couldn't escape this forest. Roman no longer knew what to believe. Had his mind abandoned him, or had reality shifted? The radio signal grew stronger. With every step, something was growing inside them. Something other than fear. Someone was calling them here, and they could feel it, as if they hadn't come here on their own. Someone had called them to this forest, and finally, they emerged into an open area. The ground had cracked open at the center, and right in the middle of the crack, there was an old Soviet-made radio box. Roman slowly approached the radio box and bent down to pick it up. He lifted the lid. Beneath it, there was nothing, a hollow opening into the darkness. A voice came from the radio again, as if someone were following them. "Go down. Maxim is waiting for you there." Petrenko sat down on the ground. He leaned his back against the tree and began to think. After a short while, he said only this: "This is not a signal. This is not the war itself. This is the voice of the night." And this was the moment when the line of no return was drawn. I think it's too late to go back now. Daylight faded, and the sky began to darken. Someone seemed to be following them over the radio, talking constantly. The forest didn't want to let them go, and was pulling them deeper inside. Who do you think the call was for? Could Maxim really be alive? Did something happen to him? Or is this signal an echo rising from the darkness of the human mind? Should they go down? What would you do if you were them? When Roman opened the radio box, the cold he felt wasn't just a breeze coming from the depths of the earth. It was as if this cold was an eye, a memory, a waiting. This cold was moving deeper into his body. Petrenko remained silent. Everyone waited for him to speak, but he was bent over his knees, his chin resting on his fist, thinking. A voice rising from within, Roman urged him to act. Go back. But this voice was not the voice of reason. It was the voice of fear, and no one yet understood how valuable a guide fear could be. The voice from the radio echoed in his ears once more. This time it was clearer, more human, but that made it even more dangerous. Was someone waiting below to kill them? There's a light down there. Maxim is here. Andrei fixed his eyes on Roman. Roman saw the hesitation in his eyes. He hesitated to go down. Stepan took the cross from his back and kissed it. God protect us. Then he put it back in his jacket. This was preparation, and preparation was half the decision. Petrenko finally raised his head. "The rope," he said simply. Roman's throat tightened. He hadn't commented on any of this, and those were the only words he had spoken. "I'll go down first," he said, his voice cracking. Petrenko didn't even shake his head, but his eyes softened for a moment. The pit was a hole a few feet wide. It was surrounded by frozen earth and was dark, but the inside was not natural. It looked like it was made of stone. It didn't look like a natural hole, but rather like a construction. Everyone who looked inside noticed it. It wasn't a cave, it was a structure. Someone had built it for a purpose. They tied the rope to Roman's waist and shoulders. When Roman took his first step, he felt his knees tremble. He wasn't just afraid of the height. As they descended, the air changed. The cold wasn't just coming from outside, it was coming from inside. It wasn't something that penetrated his bones. It was something that seemed to come from within him. After descending about 5 meters, his feet touched the ground. The ground was soft like mud, but this wasn't like soil. It was as if it had been covered with old cloth. When Roman touched the ground, he realized the truth. This wasn't cloth. This was a uniform, old, rotten, torn pieces of clothing belonging to the Ukrainian army. Petrenko's voice came over the radio. "Give me a status report." Roman swallowed hard and shouted upward. "The landing was successful. The area seems safe, but I'm not alone here. There are others here." When the other soldiers landed, not a single one of them spoke a word. They only made eye contact with each other. There was a dark, narrow room, and it seemed to grow wider with every step. The corridor, which started from under the radio box, continued with neat lines, as if carved by human hands. The walls were made of stone, and the interior was dark. There were many different marks on the walls. These marks resembled fingerprints, but these marks were not normal marks. Someone was trying to tell a story. Every mark pointed upward. It was as if someone had tried to climb up, but couldn't. Roman's heart was pounding in his chest. Stepan muttered as if in prayer. Andrei walked without looking back. Petrenko, however, slowed down. A door appeared in front of them, and he stopped in front of it. It was an old, rusty metal door. On it was a warning in Russian letters. No entry. Facility 412. Roman whispered, "Was this an old Soviet facility?" Petrenko did not answer, but that silence was the answer itself. They slowly opened the door, and a strong smell of dampness spread inside. Not dust, not mold, the smell of time. Inside were rusty filing cabinets, and, scattered on the floor, half-burned and torn documents. There was a wooden table. On it was an old photograph with no frame. In the photograph were 5 soldiers. All of them were wearing Soviet uniforms. The youngest among them looked a lot like Maxim. "This is impossible," said Andrei. Roman picked up the notebook lying on the corner of the desk. The notebook had no cover. It was quite old and had droplets that looked like blood on it. He opened the notebook. On the first page, it simply read, "Sound comes first. Light comes later. Night always begins here." Petrenko was acting nervous, as if he was hiding something. His calm demeanor was now making Roman uneasy. It was as if he had been here before and knew this place very well. It was as if he wasn't here for the first time. Roman realized something was wrong at that moment, but it was already too late for everything. Suddenly a loud voice echoed through the room. "Someone's here!" They all ran in that direction. The room was pitch black. The walls were cracked, and water was dripping from the ceiling. In the corner, kneeling on his knees, a soldier. The soldier raised his head. It was as if the soldier had no face. It was as if his face was covered by a mask. His cheeks, ears, eyes, there was nothing. Only his lips remained, and those lips moved slowly. "Why are you here?" The faceless soldier stood motionless. Andrei was terrified and began to back away, but he couldn't take his eyes off him. Roman thought at first that it was a hallucination, perhaps a figment of the darkness. But no, the soldier was still there, waiting. Petrenko stepped forward. He bowed before the man. The faceless figure tilted its head slightly to the side, like a dog, not like a stranger, like a familiar face. "This isn't possible," said Stepan. "I've never seen anything like this in battle." The faceless soldier whispered suddenly, "We are still on duty." The voice penetrated directly into his brain. It wasn't like the sound of a microphone. It was more like a parasite speaking through his thoughts. Petrenko knelt down. He didn't say anything for a while. He whispered in a low voice, 412th Combat Group. "Are you really them?" The faceless soldier bowed his head. And at that moment, Roman understood. Petrenko had been here before. They wanted to retreat and go back up, but the rope they had left at the entrance had suddenly disappeared. All that remained was a burnt, torn piece. Someone or something wanted to keep them captive there. Andrei raised his own radio to call for help. "Base, we need to get out of here. Code Alpha 7. I repeat, the exit point has collapsed." But it was no use. The radio only emitted static. Then, a whisper. "It's still too early. They can't hear you yet." Pushing their fears aside, they decided to venture deeper into the facility. The faceless soldier stood motionless. He had become a statue of some sort. Petrenko's demeanor had changed. He was showing them the way, not like a leader, like a guide. Roman noticed the change, and became angry. "Why do you know this place so well?" he asked. Petrenko stopped. He didn't answer. He just kept walking. Roman grew angry and quickly walked toward Petrenko. "Answer me. How do you know? Are you an enemy?" Suddenly, symbols began to appear on the walls. Most were outside the Slavic alphabet. It was a different alphabet. Some resembled Latin, but were completely unrecognizable. Some of them were just like the whispers they had heard on the radio. The symbols seemed to be vibrating. When you looked at them, they appeared to be stationary. But when you looked away, they moved. At one point, Stepan collapsed to the ground and began to pray. He covered his ears with his hands. "Voices," he said. "Constant voices. Someone get us out of here." Roman bent down. "What sounds?" Stepan replied, crying. "The walls are telling me my name. Can't you hear them?" Roman was very surprised by what he said and couldn't make sense of it. They continued on their way, trying to get away from there and find an exit. As they moved forward, another room appeared before them. The door was ajar. Inside were heavy iron chests, and on top of them were stacked sound recording devices, reel-to-reel type, old Soviet models. This place looked like an experimental laboratory. The sound recording devices were quite old. Petrenko opened one of them. Inside he found a cassette and a radio. He rewound the tape. He pressed a button. Click. And then the voice came. A woman's voice. Tired, hoarse, but clear. "Experiment 14 completed. The test subject cannot recognize himself. He keeps repeating the same question. Whose memory am I?" Roman closed his eyes. This wasn't just a military facility. It was a memory laboratory. Stepan couldn't stand up. Andrei shouted angrily, "Why did you bring us here, Petrenko? Where is this place? Explain this situation immediately." Petrenko's voice was as hard as steel. "You will understand everything. This is where the lost return." At that moment, a ticking sound came from inside the wall, like a human fingernail tapping on glass, rhythmically, like a code. Roman suddenly stopped and looked at Andrei, and as he stopped, the ticking sound repeated. It was Morse code. Roman took out his notebook and pen from his bag. He began to write. /dash. /. Then he looked at the notebook. His eyes froze. "I is mine, prosulu sim." It seemed meaningless, but Petrenko suddenly moved his lips. "No, it's an anagram." He scrambled the sentence. He read it again. "I am prosulu, I sim, my eye is prosulu." Roman didn't understand, but Stepan whispered, "Prosulu, protocol subject, luxury." And then his eyes widened. "This isn't a person. This is a voice recording. Who is Maxim? Who does Petrenko work for? Why can't they go upstairs?" Roman collapsed to the ground and continued to jot down the clicks in his notebook. But the codes were no longer progressing in a straight line. They weren't words. They were being transmitted like emotions, fear, doubt, and sorrow. At that moment, the radio began to operate on its own. No one had touched it. No one had made a call, but a voice came, a very familiar voice. "Petrenko, they're awake. Time is running out. It's time to ascend." Roman's hands trembled. Cold sweat dripped down Stepan's forehead. Andrei cursed and threw the radio to the ground. "What's happening here? Someone explain to me what's going on immediately." Petrenko slowly turned around. His face was emotionless for the first time. But his eyes told the whole story. There was a crime there, and a sense of acceptance. Roman asked, "What do you mean, rise? What is this place, Petrenko?" He didn't answer, but behind the walls, Behind those old rusty metal panels, a vibration began, a faint hum, then a rhythmic sound. Zisht, click, zisht. It was as if a motor was running. Something was waking up after years. Petrenko raised his head. His face was no longer that of someone who had lost his way. It was the face of someone who had charted his own course. 1962, he said. The first Russian experiment. Mind transfer and memory synchronization. Code name, Simulacrum. The experiment failed, but we didn't stop. Andriy stepped forward. We? You? Are you working for Soviet intelligence? Petrenko just smiled. Not me, my brother. But I grew up listening to what was done here. And then, in 2023, I returned to the area. The signal was still open. No one had turned off the devices. I realized that someone was still thinking. Roman stepped back slowly. This wasn't just a facility. This place was a living memory dungeon. Petrenko was the key and guide to this dungeon. Suddenly the panels beneath the floor opened. Steam began to rise from inside. An old elevator appeared. Rusty, half-rotted, its cables almost severed, but it still worked. The elevator's light came on. Inside was a recording device. It read, "Recording Maxim." Date, February 2024. Roman swallowed hard. Andriy played the recording. Maxim's voice echoed in the gloomy emptiness. If you're listening to this recording, I'm not the person you know anymore. They split my memory. I see my own silhouette on the walls. My voice echoes in other mouths. Petrenko isn't the one who did this to me. But he didn't stop them either. I'm not lost. They copied me. If you want to find me, you must go to the top floor. But I'm warning you, each floor took a piece of me. Some of my pieces are no longer like humans. Sweat poured down Roman's back. Stepan closed his eyes. Andriy bowed his head. Petrenko said only this, "Follow me. This is our final descent." The elevator started up with a creak. When they reached the bottom, the darkness was thicker, denser. The air was almost unbreathable. It wasn't water flowing from the walls. It was darkness. At the end of the tunnel was a room. The door was heavy, sealed with electricity. Petrenko pulled an old card from his pocket. On it was a faded emblem, Soviet Union, Psyche Unit. The door opened on its own. This was not a laboratory, and they found themselves facing a tomb. Hundreds of computers and monitors had been set up here by someone. Each one displayed something different, different faces of Maxim. Sometimes a baby, sometimes a child, sometimes a young man, sometimes an old man, sometimes crying, sometimes with no eyes at all. There were dozens of Maxims on the screens. Andriy approached one of the monitors. As he got closer, the screen flickered, and Maxim spoke. "I no longer recognize you, but you're still searching for me. What if I'm the one running away from you?" Was Maxim still alive? Or was he just part of the experiment? On one of the monitors inside the laboratory, Maxim's eyes were staring directly at Roman. It wasn't just an image. It felt like there was a camera there, and his gaze was alive. The screens connected, the sounds merged, and the echoes overlapped. If you forget who you are, you're lost. Roman stepped back. Andriy slammed his fist against a monitor, but the image didn't disappear. Instead, another screen opened. This time, Maxim's face wasn't on the screen. There was only an indistinct, intriguing silhouette, a shadow memory, and that shadow spoke. "You can't stop me now, because I was never here. But you stayed here. You won't be able to leave." Stepan collapsed to the ground. He brought his hands to his head. He was just thinking. His eyes were empty. "They forgot me," he said. "My family, my commander, even myself." Then he turned his head. He looked at Roman, but there was nothing familiar in his gaze. He seemed like a different person. Petrenko left the room and slowly made his way down the corridor. He stopped in front of a deep door. The door bore the following inscription: "Psychotransfer, Capsule Room. Those who enter do not leave as themselves." As Petrenko approached, the door opened automatically. Inside was a round room with a rusty stretcher in the center. On it was a metal helmet covered in dust, a neural recording device. Next to it was a glass cabin. Inside the cabin, there was someone, pale-skinned, eyes open but unresponsive. And this person was Stepan. Andrei screamed. No, this can't be." Stepan was still on the floor, but at the same time he was in the cabin. Roman stepped back. All the air had shifted. Reality was no longer single-layered. It was as if they were in a different dimension. Petrenko spoke sheepishly, but his voice was no longer that of someone telling a story, but that of someone confessing. "We thought we had buried the mistakes, but the mind isn't like the earth. Whatever you bury there, one day it grows in dreams and in the mind." Andrei lunged forward. "What is this? What nonsense is this?" Petrenko's eyes filled with tears, and finally, he spoke the truth. "I chose Maxim for this experiment because his mind was less resistant than the others. After he was wounded in battle, he was already dead. I uploaded what was left of him into the system, but the system multiplied him beyond control." Roman's stomach churned. This wasn't just an experiment. This was a physical disintegration, the replication of a human consciousness, but with each copy losing a bit more of its soul. Suddenly, Stepan in the cabin moved. He blinked. His lips twitched. "Which one of us is real?" At that moment, the Stepan outside spoke at the same time. "Which one of us is real?" Andrei stepped back. Roman closed his eyes, accepting everything. Now every figure, every sound, every image inside. Was it a reflection, or was it a distorted memory fragment? No one had touched the radio, but suddenly it turned on. Exit is not possible. Simulation is active. All components are under observation. Roman suddenly froze. Simulation? Then, was even their descent here a script? When Stepan in the cabin opened his eyes completely, the air inside suddenly grew heavy. It was as if the chemistry of the oxygen had changed, and the environment had become airless, with no trace of oxygen remaining. All the monitors activated at the same time. Suddenly they all locked onto a single frame. The image on the monitor showed a snow-covered, dark, and abandoned border outpost. Its roof was tilted, its windows broken, and inside that ruin, there was only one figure, Maximum. But Maxim wasn't alive. He looked dead, or he wasn't making any effort to look alive, and was simply unconscious. He was sitting on a stool, staring blankly out the window. His eyes were not visible, but it was clear what he was looking at. He was staring into the void, the indescribable void that had formed after the war, sinking into the soul. Roman approached the monitor with a trembling breath. The camera angle slowly changed. But who had turned it? Was it moving on its own? Or was someone inside watching them? A click came from inside the cabin. Stepan's eyelids fluttered. But at the same moment, the Stepan outside rubbed his eyes. This was no longer a contradiction. It was a paradox. Roman turned his head. "This is impossible. This is physically impossible." Andrei lunged forward. "This image isn't live," he said. "This isn't a recording. This is a mental replay. This man may still be alive, but only inside his mind. Petrenko hadn't spoken until then, but now he leaned slowly toward the monitor. His hands were in his pockets, but his fingers were trembling. There was no trace of the man who had once been a commander. He was acting like an ordinary soldier. All that remained was a shadow of regret. "I keep watching this mistake over and over," he whispered. "With each cycle, a little more. I feel less. Maybe this is my punishment." Roman stepped back. Another wall had collapsed. But which wall? Reality, trust, or conscience? Suddenly the walls began to spin. Yes, they were really spinning. They weren't physically moving, but it was as if they were inside a memory capsule. You know how some dreams are. You enter a room, but when you open the door, you find yourself back in your childhood. That was exactly how Roman felt at that moment. Images began to flash before his eyes like a movie set. The schoolyard, concrete roofs glistening with frost in the winter sun. In the background, a megaphone. The Soviet anthem is playing, and a child, walking alone in the snow, dropping his diary to the ground. On the cover it reads, "I want to fly. I don't care where. I just want to fly." Roman touched the monitor. When his fingers touched the screen, it felt like he was touching snow. This wasn't just an image. It was an emotional transfer. The monitor wasn't just playing Maxim's childhood memories. It was bringing them to life. Andrei approached one of the monitors to turn it off. As he searched for the cable, the same thoughts echoed in his head. He quickly pulled the power cable behind him. But the screen didn't turn off. The image didn't change either. The screen didn't even move. The power wasn't cut off. "You can't shut down the system from the outside," said Stepan. But was that Stepan outside? Or was it the one coming out of the cabin? Which one was it? They were no longer two people, the same person, in two bodies. But which one was first? Which one was real? Roman swallowed in astonishment at all that was happening. His throat was dry. He forced out a voice. "Which Stepan came with us?" Stepan smiled. "No one came with you, Roman. You came. We've always been here." The monitor echoed a sentence coming from inside the wall. "The lie of memory cannot suppress the truth of emotion." This was no longer a memory simulation. This was a brain invasion. Minds had surrendered before bodies. Silence fell over the room. For a moment, there was truly no sound, no breath, no vibration, no machines, nothing. Then, Roman's walkie-talkie in his pocket opened on its own, despite him doing nothing, hissing softly. The incoming voices were clear. There were no static or hissing sounds. Unlike the distorted signals, this, as if it were a live broadcast. Maxim's voice came through the radio, slow, steady, emotionless, but every word was as sharp as a knife. "Roman, I'm still here, but my body, it's not here. My memory has been duplicated here. My emotions have been split. But I have one thing left. I remember who brought me here." Roman slowly turned his head toward Petrenko. It wasn't just anger anymore. There was a deep sense of betrayal in his eyes. The radio spoke again. "He didn't bring me here to save me in the war. He brought me here to get his own memory back. He's inside me. He hid his dead brother's face inside me." Andrei shouted, screamed. "This is impossible. Maxim wasn't your test subject. He was our friend." But Petrenko's face, it had collapsed. His shoulders seemed to be letting go of a 40-year-old burden. The soldiers tensed up and felt compelled to explain. They began to reveal the entire truth. "My brother died in 1986, he said. I couldn't even go to his grave. I still don't know where he is. But then, I saw Maxim. His eyes and scent were exactly like my brother's. I just wanted to face that feeling one more time. And I loaded my own memories into his memory. Roman held back his tears. This wasn't just an experiment. This was memory abuse. But the scariest part was, maybe Maxim was still alive, but not in his own body. He had become someone else's purpose. After all this talk, the walls, radios, and monitors fell silent for a moment. Everything was submerged in that unsettling silence where reality seemed suspended for a moment. And then, a faint hum rose from the floor. Roman took a step back. The ground beneath his feet began to tremble, as if it wasn't the floor, but his own insides shaking. Petrenko's voice came from behind, hoarse and slow. We touched his consciousness. We're in his world now. We did it. Suddenly all the lights burst into life. But the darkness hadn't fallen. On the contrary, a new light had emerged. It wasn't the cold, artificial light of a room lamp. It was more like the inner light of human memories. The cabin was no longer a cabin. Those inside were no longer soldiers. Everything had bent inward toward a field of consciousness. And there, right in front of them, Maxim appeared. But this was not the flesh and bone Maxim. This was a being with infinity burning in its pupils. Its appearance was unclear. One moment it was a child, the next, a young man. His face changed every second. Roman's throat went dry. He tried to say something, but no sound came out. Maxim spoke in a quiet tone. Which memory do you think is real, Roman? Which one do you think is yours, and which one is mine? Suddenly, all the walls, screens, and boundaries in the room vanished. Roman was now walking inside his own mind. But this consciousness was not under his control. Someone else was in charge. The floor beneath his feet was the wooden planks of his childhood home. The walls around him bore traces of an old Soviet barracks. The smells, a mix of dried blood, rusty metal, and the scent of old skin. He saw a wooden table in front of him. On the table was a radio. On the table was a piece of paper with only one sentence written on it. You gave me this order. Roman pulled his hands back and shook his head. No, I just... But another voice spoke this time. This time, it was his own voice. It wasn't the enemy's bullet that killed me. It was your silence. Roman collapsed to his knees. His eyes stared into the void. The guilt, shame, and regret he had suppressed for years. All of it shattered the glass of his mind and flooded in at once. On the ground, Petrenko's brother's face suddenly appeared. But the face was Maxim's, but the eyes were Roman's. And in that moment, he understood. Nothing was separate. Everything had become entangled. Every face, every victim, every decision was connected. The war wasn't just on the front lines. Inside, there was a darker war raging within. Stepan, was he still standing? Was he alive? Andrei looked around. Stepan was gone, but he had left no trace behind. No footprints, no voice recordings, no video. Roman whispered, "Did Stepan never come with us?" Andrei couldn't answer that question because he didn't know the answer and couldn't remember. He couldn't clearly remember when Stepan had come with them or under what mission they had met. He couldn't remember any of it. The radio crackled again, this time a very faint female voice. Code 09. The information itself is the virus. Petrenko collapsed to the ground and sat on his knees, beginning to think. God, are we inside him, or is he inside us? Maxim's consciousness returned. This time everything was clearer. His face was now clearly visible, but Roman realized with horror that face was his own. So this wasn't just Maxim's mind. This was the crystallized form of a shared trauma. It was now impossible to tell who was who. Everything was too confused. Roman screamed, "Who am I?" Silence reigned. Then, the same radio transmitted one last message. The only thing that can be identified now is regret. The light behind the door slowly dimmed. It was neither complete darkness nor light. To those who looked at it, it was a void where time stood still. Space ceased to exist, and meaning decayed. Roman was still trying to breathe, collapsed on the floor, but every breath he took seemed to be working in reverse. The deeper he breathed, the further reality receded. When Andrei closed his eyes, he no longer saw his childhood memories. He began to see someone else's memories. It was as if someone had uploaded something into his mind from outside. A train car, a snow-covered railway track, a trembling child inside. But that child was not him. "This is not my memory," he whispered. At that very moment, a radio dropped from the ceiling. It seemed to have fallen on its own. At the end of the radio, there was a moldy button still glowing. A voice came from the radio. "Code 09 active. Consciousness integrity has collapsed. From this moment onward, no soldier may return." Petrenko jumped to his feet. No, this was supposed to be a simulation. This was supposed to be just a training exercise. But the steel plates on the floor began to tremble. Everything began to warp. It was as if the fabric of consciousness was folding, bending, tearing. The radio whispered another sentence, this time in a tone that was almost compassionate. "Access to reality has been revoked." The walls melted. The floor collapsed. Everything was in shambles. The characters began to sink into their own mental structures. The last thing seen, Maxim's face, multiplying in an infinite mirror, staring at Roman. In one of those infinite mirrors, the only thing still breathing was the viewer himself. Time had come to a standstill. Or perhaps the concept of time no longer had any meaning. When Andrei opened his eyes, the first thing he noticed was that he could breathe. But the air he drew into his lungs was unfamiliar. It wasn't the sharp smell of gunpowder from the battle, nor the musty dampness of the forest. This air seemed to be filtering through emptiness. It was the smell of his brain. When he turned his head, he saw Roman's face. His eyes were open but expressionless, unresponsive but alive. He looked at him with a strange calmness, as if caught in a moment of stillness. "Roman?" Andrei called out to him. There was no response. A voice rose behind them, this time faint, distant, but familiar. "You've always been here." Maxim's voice, but this time there was no physical source. The voice was coming from somewhere else, not from the stone walls, but from within them. The radio was gone. The codes, the screens, the red lights. Everything had vanished in an instant, only four walls and the sound of a slow wind. There was one truth, and that was, the simulation wasn't over, because the simulation had never started. As Roman looked around, still unable to respond, he heard a child crying, not in his mind, but directly in his ears. Then the child actually appeared. It was a small, frail, pale figure. He was wearing a military jacket from the Soviet era. He was holding an old radio in his hand. Andrei swallowed hard. This isn't mine. But the child turned his face toward him. His eyes were the same as Andrei's, exactly the same. The child raised the radio and spoke. "You didn't call us back. You heard the order, but you didn't call us back." Suddenly, the environment shook. The walls reshaped themselves. It was as if reality was shifting like a curtain. Petrenko appeared out of nowhere. He had a heavy bag on his back and a blank expression on his face. The map he was holding burned and turned to ash. "The coordinates are wrong," he said. "They never made it." Andrei tried to make sense of the scene, but he realized this moment was a memory from the future, an event that hadn't happened yet, but whose regret was already felt. The simulation wasn't just showing the past anymore. It was showing potential futures. Their minds were trapped in the labyrinth of war, and there was no way out. The final step, a void. Andrei and Roman were now silent. They felt that speaking was pointless in the face of all this. Their minds were communicating with each other. No words, no shapes, no expressions, like a dream. Both of them sat down on the ground. The ground beneath their feet felt like a void, not soil, but they weren't falling. It was as if all reality had accumulated on the outer layer of their consciousness. Maxim's last message echoed in their minds. No one is lost in war anymore. Everyone disappears at the moment of decision, and that decision echoes forever. Roman opened his mouth as if to say something, and only one sentence came out. "I wish I could call them back." Andrei slowly lowered his head. A radio voice came through one last time. This time the message was clear. It was a human voice, broken and heartbroken. "Code 09 complete. Consciousnesses are being stabilized. Return is impossible. Return is impossible. Return is impossible." The voice echoed, and then everything went dark. And now, with the screen black, a single question echoes in the viewer's mind. If you were in his place, would you have made the same decision? What about you? Have you ever heard of Code 09? In 2025, wars are no longer fought with guns and tanks. As you can see from this story, they're now fought with technology and mental experiments. As you can see from the war between Russia and Ukraine, such capturings and unethical events are taking place. The effects of this war, which has lasted for years, will undoubtedly last for centuries. What do you think about this war? Like and subscribe to support us for more videos with similar stories.